the senator from Alabama and the senator from Wyoming for their leadership on this important issue. The crisis in Ukraine has riveted our attention for the last 4 months as we've seen brave men and women standing in the freezing cold, standing for freedom, standing for their desire to stand with the West, to stand with Europe, to stand with America, and to be free from the domination of Putin's Russia. We all strongly support the efforts of the Ukrainian people to choose a different path from subjugation to Russia, to choose a path towards economic and political liberty and towards a closer friendship with the West. And Madam President, all of us on both sides of the chamber are united in decrying the military aggression of Russian strongman Vladimir Putin, as he has invaded a sovereign nation with military force, committing an act of war. And no one should be confused as to what Mr. Putin is attempting to do. Indeed, acting Ukrainian Prime Minister Yatsenyuk said very clearly that Putin is trying to reestablish the borders of the old Soviet Union, is expanding sadly into a vacuum of leadership the United States has not been filling. Russia is filling that vacuum. And the seizure of Crimea is only the beginning of Putin's aggressiveness, and he will continue, I would predict, to be aggressive unless and until he meets significant resistance. We are also united in believing there's an important role for the United States to play in responding to this crisis. I believe that we should take concrete actions to respond to Russia's invasion of the Crimea. Number one, we should press to expel Russia from the G8. Number two, the administration should immediately begin enforcing the Magnitsky Act, which it has failed to do up to this point, designed to punish human rights atrocities by Russian government officials. And indeed, we should expand it to include Ukrainian human rights abusers. And number three, we should immediately reinstall the anti-ballistic missile batteries in Eastern Europe that were scheduled to go in, that President Obama mistakenly canceled in an effort to appease Mr. Putin. That effort did not succeed, and we should go forward with allowing Eastern Europe to defend itself. Additionally, there's a great deal we can do to aid the people of Ukraine. The President should immediately offer the government of Ukraine a free trading agreement, indicating that their goods are welcome in the United States and our goods in their country. And we should explore other options to assist them in economic recovery consistent with free market principles, including moving as expeditiously as possible to allow them access to U.S. energy exports, and in particular, liquid natural gas. Russia uses natural gas and energy as a tool of economic blackmail. It is critical to the source of Russia's power, not just over Ukraine, but over much of Europe. The United States is blessed with abundant supplies of natural gas, and it is only foolhardy government policy that stands in the way of our exporting that natural gas, meeting the need, and helping Ukraine be free of the economic blackmail. We should move immediately in that regard, not just because it would help Ukraine, not just because it would represent a serious blow to Russia, Russia relies on the revenue from those energy exports. And if the United States steps up and provides them instead, that's a serious economic blow to Russia. But not just that, but because it makes perfect sense from the perspective of the United States of America, from our economic interest. At a time when we've got the lowest labor rate participation since 1978, when millions of people are out of work and hurting, we should be developing and expanding our resources, and energy provides an opportunity to transform the geopolitical playing field, to use our abundant resources in a free market manner to respond and to help liberate the people of Ukraine. And there is also a financial component of the assistance from Ukraine that it makes a world of sense should come from the International Monetary Fund, to which the United States is a contributor. That's what the IMF was created to do. And the IMF today stands fully capable of meeting that need. Now, Madam President, my friend from Arizona has an admirable passion on this issue for the people of Ukraine and for standing up to Mr. Putin. And I commend my friend for Arizona for his passion in this regard. However, the reason this bill has not passed today is because the majority of this chamber, the majority leader, made a decision. The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee made a decision to inject into the aid and sanctions plan for Ukraine an extraneous issue, an issue of the IMF that has nothing to do with the underlying issue. That was a mistake. That was a mistake, and I would suggest these so-called IMF reforms are misguided policy. They don't make sense for 4 separate reasons. Number one, they're unnecessary. There is no need whatsoever for these reforms. Indeed, the IMF is perfectly capable of managing the task on hand, and estimates have shown Ukrainian aid would cost no more than 5% of its current resources. So the IMF portions are unnecessary, extrinsic. I agree with the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, who says these IMF so-called reforms are unnecessary and extrinsic to this bill. But number two, these IMF provisions, if passed into law, would dramatically expand the financial exposure of the United States of America, effectively doubling our contribution, expanding our exposure. Now, if that is good policy, that should be debated on its merits. We should not be opening up the U.S. taxpayers to billions in additional financial liability without a debate on the merits. It shouldn't be just tied to Ukrainian aid and forced through the Senate. That's the wrong approach. But number three, most inexplicably, these so-called reforms, if passed, would diminish U.S. influence on the IMF, would reduce our ability to control the decisions of the IMF, indeed would move the funds from a fund in which we have veto authority to one in which we no longer have veto authority. We would have a smaller portion of influence over the IMF. And astonishingly, Madam President, number four, this bill would expand Russia's influence and control over the IMF. Let me repeat that. A bill that is being ostensibly introduced to punish Russia for their act of war and act of aggression would expand Russia's influence over the IMF and decrease the United States of America's influence. Madam President, I agree with my friend from Alabama who suggested moments ago, this is through the looking glass. This makes no sense. I would challenge any of my friends here to stand up here and explain why a sensible response to what Russia has done is to expand Russia's influence in the IMF and to diminish America's influence. That makes no sense whatsoever. Madam President, I want to close with 2 points. Number one, we could pass aid for the people of Ukraine right now, today. The senator from Wyoming rose and asked for unanimous consent to pass the bill that has already passed the House. Had the majority leader not stood up and objected on behalf of Senate Democrats, that bill would have passed into law. It would be already headed to the president's desk for signature. It is only because the majority leader objected that we are not sitting here today having already passed aid for the people of Ukraine. I would note, by the way, the majority leader had extended commentary about 2 businessmen, the Koch brothers, who I'm beginning to think are a character almost out of Dr. Seuss in the majority leader's mind. They are the Grinch who stole Christmas in his telling. And I would note he focuses on the IRS rules, not focusing on the abuse of power by the IRS that the Treasury Inspector General chronicled, but instead on the need for a vote to regulate the IRS's abuse of power. Let me just say very simply, the House bill on Ukraine doesn't mention the IRS at all. Doesn't mention C4s at all. That issue is not covered. So when the majority leader stood on the floor of this Senate and said, this is all because of the nefarious Koch brothers, set aside the impropriety of the majority leader of the United States Senate picking 2 private citizens, individuals who are engaged in political speech, standing up for what they believe, and the majority leader using his position of political power to lambaste them, to target them. Interestingly enough, the majority leader does not seem to have a problem with a California billionaire who's publicly pledged to put $100 million behind Democrats to press them to pass climate change legislation that would cost millions of jobs across this country, from blue-collar workers, from hardworking Americans. That billionaire, in the majority leader's view, is perfectly fine to spend $100 million in the election, but the Koch brothers, because the two of them have stood up and expressed their views, are subject to vilification and personal attack from the majority leader. Madam President, the Senate rules allow a member of this body, if his or her integrity is impugned, to raise an objection. Let me ask you something, Madam President. What Senate rule allows a private citizen to raise an objection when his integrity is impugned by the majority leader? Those two brothers are not members of this body, so they can have their reputation dragged through the mud. And yet they are denied a point of personal privilege to come and defend themselves. That is not the job of the United States Senate, to vilify private citizens. And I would note that the provision he's talking about is not in the House bill, which means when the senator from Wyoming stood up and asked for consent to pass the House bill, if the majority leader had simply refrained from objecting, we would have passed aid to Ukraine tonight. It's nothing to do with the Koch brothers, nothing to do with the IRS. That's not in the House bill. The reason the majority leader objected is that he wants to hold aid to the Ukraine hostage to force through these misguided IMF reforms. That is the wrong decision. Final point I want to make, Madam President. The world should understand. Russia should understand. The people of Ukraine should understand. Mr. Putin should understand that all of us are united in standing with the people of Ukraine. That the United States will act, I am convinced, and will act decisively to impose sanctions and serious consequences on Russia for this unprovoked act of war. We will act decisively to stand with the people of Ukraine. There should be no doubt in any observer's mind that this will unify both parties. We will stand together. We would have done so tonight had the majority leader not made the cynical decision to hold aid for Ukraine hostage to force a partisan bill that does not enjoy sufficient support in this body to pass otherwise. Politics should end at the water's edge. And I think it's unfortunate to see the majority leader trying to use the crisis in Ukraine for political advantage. That's the mistake, but there should be no ambiguity. We will impose sanctions. We will stand with Ukraine. And the people of America understand that Mr. Putin's aggression is reliving the days when the Soviet Union was an evil empire. It's reliving those days. Mr. Putin calls the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of modern times. Well, all of us surely hope he does not succeed in his intentions of restoring the Soviet Union, restoring that evil empire, restoring the cloud of oppression across Europe and across the world. And we stand united with the people of Ukraine and with the people surrounding Russia in support of freedom and against his unconscionable act of war. Madam President, I yield the floor.
President.